Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the inaugural session of a Writers in Conversation series. My name is Jing Han. I'm the director of the Institute for Australian and Asian Arts and Culture at Western Sydney University. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge that we are on the land of a Baramatical people of Darug Nation, whose ancestors have been the traditional owners of their land for thousands of years, and pay our respect to First Nations elders past and present. The Institute for Australian and Asian Arts and Culture, in collaboration with the Writing and Society Research Centre at Western Sydney University, is truly thrilled to have Shankari Chandran, winner of the 2023 Miles Franklin Literary Award for her highly acclaimed novel, Chat Time at Cinnamons Gardens, as our inaugural guest in this Writers in Conversation series. A very brief introduction of our guest today before we start the conversation. Shankari Chandran was born in London to Sri Lankan Tamil parents and grew up in Canberra. She studied law at the University of New South Wales and has worked as a lawyer in the social justice field for 2 decades. Her literary career began with the novel Song of the Sun God in 2017, which was longlisted for International Dublin Literature Award. She continued with The Barrier, which was shortlisted for the Normal K. Hemming Award. Her third novel, Chat Time at the Cinnamons Gardens, won the 2023 Miles Franklin Literary Award. In 2024, she released Safe Haven, addressing themes of migration and trauma of a detention center, and Unfinished Business, a political thriller. Beyond her novels, Shankari has contributed to anthologies like Another Australia and serves as the deputy chair of Writing New South Wales. She lives in Sydney with her husband and 4 children. Following my conversation with Shankari, we will have our creative writing students of Western Sydney University to ask their questions. Being a mother of 4 and having written 5 novels whilst holding a job, you can imagine how busy Shankari will be as a person, and time is the most precious for her. And so to use our precious time with her, I've prepared my list of questions. Now, Shankari, welcome to Writers in Conversation. Such an honor and privilege to have you today.
Oh, thank you, Jing. The honor is mine. I'm so excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
Okay, let's start with my first question. People, including myself, who have read your books, are very much taken aback, surprised, but also amazed by the power of your storytelling and the stories that you told in your books. The highest recognition of your literary achievement through Miles Franklin Award in 2023 is a public and critical recognition of you as a highly accomplished Australian writer. Were you surprised by this recognition within a relatively short span of 5 or 6 years since the publication of your first novel in 2017?
I was so surprised. I'll always be surprised by that win, to be honest. I think I still have moments where I think, wow, what a gift from the universe that was. And although I know you said it's only 5 years since the publication of my first novel, it does feel like I've been writing for a very long time. And so all writers know that it is very hard graft, and while the success may seem sudden, it's hard earned, right? It's come through a decade of writing and trying to get published, and then through years before that of really practicing the art of writing. So yes, I was thoroughly surprised, and continue to be incredibly grateful today.
What has the Miles Franklin Award meant to you?
It's been life altering, to be honest. It's really changed my career because it has given my career opportunities for profile that it did not previously have. And that for writers from a purely sort of commercial perspective, it means that my books are selling to people other than my cousins. You know, it's going further than my community and my own personal network, and it's reaching audiences who didn't previously know anything about Sri Lanka, and that's really rewarding to see. It has also given me opportunities to raise the profile of those issues that are important to me in that novel and in my other work. And it's given me the confidence to keep writing and to keep going. And there's something very beautiful about the Miles Franklin itself, because it is such an Australian award that recognizes a contribution or a reflection of Australian life. And as the child of immigrants, I've always grappled with my identity as an Australian. Am I Australian? I've always felt not Australian enough for this country. And so to be recognised with the award for Australian literature for a story that is so personally Sri Lankan Tamil, but also Australian, or Australia therefore being an encompassing identity of all the things, is very gratifying to achieve that recognition.
I relate to all what you have just said, and it is actually Miles Franklin Award that caught my eyes to read this time, and then the
Excellent.
things, and I read all of your books. So it is fascinating, as you mentioned. Not everyone or many people actually don't know much about Sri Lanka or Sri Lankan Australian writers. So it is such an important recognition. How did you learn your craft? You mentioned that you started writing way before, 2017.
Yes, I think writing is a skill, like
Mm.
like any skill, it requires practice. And so I know that throughout my life I've been writing. My career as a lawyer has demanded of me that I write in different forms, and I've always loved creative writing, but I didn't have the courage until about 2012 to write creatively in the long form. So as a child or teenager, even in my early 20s, I wrote short stories, but never applied myself or had the confidence to give the novel a go, because a novel is anywhere between 80,000 and 100,000 words, and that's a big leap of faith that you take when you open a Word document and begin at the blank page. And then when I sat down to really try to land a novel, the writing of the novel itself is the practice that you're undertaking, and the rewriting of it, the editing of it, the willingness to open it up for criticism. So I will, when I get to the end of a first draft, I have trusted first readers. I will go to them and I will say, please tell me how to make it better, or at the very least, tell me what's wrong with it. And I take those notes seriously. We call them notes. And I receive my notes and try to receive my notes with humility. It is extremely painful to have your work criticized. But I trust that the people that are looking at that work are wanting me to do as well as I can do. And they want the thing that I want, which is to produce high quality work, to see that work published and to see it read and enjoyed and creating connection with readers. So I have to sort of steel myself for the process and continue. I've done courses on creative writing, which I really should have started. I should have done those courses before I started my first novel, because I'd produced this first novel. I thought it was okay, did various creative writing courses, and then learned certain skills and learned that I'd probably broken every rule of creative writing in my first draft, and probably only learned how to do better on about the 15th draft. So for me, writing is hard work, and I am prepared to do that hard work and to do the editing that's required. So I smash out a first draft, I stop, I send it to people, or I'll usually go back and do it 5 more times. I'll look at it 5 more times, then send it to first readers, receive their critique, go back again. And so it's that willingness to go back again that I think has been crucial for me.
Yeah, it's incredible experience to share. It is. It must be painful to read all the criticism about what you have thought and written the best way you can. Yeah.
Yes, I'm a lot better at receiving it now than I used to be.
Um, Interesting, you just mentioned as a migrant child, so national identity or your wrong identity or Australian identity is quite critical and has been very critical. And you actually never lived as a citizen in Sri Lanka. You came from there because of your parents who came from there. But all your 5 novels are connected to Sri Lanka in one way or the other. The extent or nature of the connection varies in each book. Would you contribute to this ongoing connection with Sri Lanka to your upbringing?
Yes, I think so. I think my parents were that first generation of migrant that was very fearful of losing their own culture. And so when they came to Australia, they stayed very tightly and closely within the Sri Lankan Tamil community. And they preserved a lot of their cultural ways. They are still that community is still very conservative, and they kept us as children very close because it was a very small community. And as the war progressed and generations and waves of migration have come to Australia from Sri Lanka, the size of that community has expanded significantly. So now Tamil is being taught as an HSC subject in some schools in Sydney because there is a big enough community to justify it. But I was a child of the early 80s, and it was a tiny community, and we lived a very conservative, closed, small life. And our family taught us a lot of our cultural practice and our religious practice. And at the same time, they deliberately chose not to give us language because they wanted us to speak English perfectly. And in their minds at that time, the idea of bringing another language into the home was concerning. They thought that that would impair my English or our English. And so they themselves are trilingual. They speak Tamil, Sinhalese, which is the other language of Sri Lanka, and English, whereas my brother and I only speak English. And so that is really my biggest cultural regret, is that I don't have language, and so much of culture is delivered through language. And so there is a whole dimension of culture that is missing for me. And at the same time, I have a very talkative and close family. And so there has always been, from a young age, the sharing of stories, the telling of stories, the indoctrination of culture and stories. And so we grew up learning about our history, our culture, our religion, our spirituality, our traditions through that storytelling of family members. And that has been very much a living part of my life.
It's so impressive reading your books about your in-depth knowledge of Sri Lanka history, culture, customs, and then the characterization of the character that you draw. And how did you acquaint yourself, to acquire this in-depth knowledge? Do you do a lot of research, reading, or in what way you get yourself acquainted with that?
I think a few different ways. The most important way, I think, for any writer, the most important way of being or skill for when you are trying to be a writer or are a writer, is to just pay attention, and so to be curious. And I hope that I have always been a curious person and move through the world in my relationships with curiosity, and therefore asking questions and creating space for the people around me to tell their stories and absorbing that. And I certainly had a much better memory when I was younger than when I hit 50. So I can remember the stories of my childhood that were told to me by family members. I think also that, so there's that attentiveness and observation and listening. And we were fortunate in that our parents would take us to places. So we were always going to political meetings with them. We were going to protests with them, because I was good at English. My father's English is excellent, but I like to edit things. So I would edit letters that he was writing to politicians about the war. And so from a young age, I had a real um, immersion in culture, or an active participation in these aspects that I then go on to write about. I also have a strong academic interest. I love to learn. And I think my brother and I both get that from our parents. And I really enjoy the sort of rabbit holes of research. Once you begin to research one thing and you pull at a thread, it takes you down another rabbit hole, and you pull at another thread, and I could keep going. And so and law has trained me to have a very robust and detail oriented approach to research. and a need for veracity, a need to challenge sources and to make sure that my sources are accurate, to cross-reference sources so that I'm not just receiving information from one source but from multiple. And that has those research skills, I think, have helped me, and that training has really helped me to then seek the academic work and the human rights reports from my career as a lawyer that then inflect the work that I do and give it the additional level of detail that I want it to have.
That explains the feeling when I read your books. You know, where did you get all this knowledge? And it's incredible the way that you share the experience. You mentioned that you have worked as a lawyer, you know, especially in social justice and human rights. For almost 20 years. You said in the interview, so for this conversation, I dug
Mhm.
up everything that I could, watched
Excellent.
all the interviews and read all the books about that you have written. So in this interview on ABC Compass, it's a great program. Anyone who missed that one, you can still go back to watch it on iView. And you in that interview, you said, I remember so clearly, you articulated so clearly, you said you wanted to litigate injustice in fiction.
Mhm.
And in your books, you consistently explore themes relating to race, trauma, dispossession, displacement, structural inequality, and systemic injustice. What have you seen or dealt with as a social justice lawyer that drives your deep commitment to litigating injustice in your creative writing?
I think that the beginning of that search and desire for justice comes more so from my observation of the injustices that were committed in Sri Lanka. And so that yearning for justice comes from the fact that they are my own people and I want justice for them. And then my legal career has been so helpful and supportive of being able to pursue that path. And in my legal career, I have encountered, the best and worst of humanity, really. People that are prepared to steal people from their homes, to torture them in prisons, to violate their rights, to disappear the bodies, to do all the unimaginable and yet everyday things that are done by people to others. And at the same time, I am constantly exposed to the greatness and the goodness of lawyers and activists and human rights workers who operate in that space and who try to stop that from happening and who pursue justice for survivors and for victims. And as a lawyer, I've been able to work with them, I've been able to work for them, I've been able to interview them, and all of that, and a number of those issues. So, torture, unlawful arrest and detention, inability to access lawyers or prevention of access to the justice system, the curtailing of the freedom of speech, the curtailing of freedom of press and freedom of expression, the violation of the right to self-determination, and then at the very worst, the committing of genocide and other atrocities of war. I've seen that throughout my legal career, and I have seen that most intimately happen to my own people. And then in my fiction, I bring the motivation and the skills of seeking justice together.
Hmm. And why do you think fiction, creative writing, can be more powerful than legal rulings?
That's a very good question, Jing. I think I have a very not ambivalent. Ambivalent is not the right word. I feel that I have a strained relationship with the law and the systems of justice because I expect so much from them. And I see that they do so much good. And I also see that they fail people. And I find myself increasingly turning to fiction to not necessarily prosecute and achieve justice outcomes, because the prosecution of a matter and the achieving of the justice outcome can only be done through the systems of law. But I do see the enormous value of bringing to light the hidden injustices and recording the truth of what happened. And to litigate it, as I said before, to bring all of the sides out into the open and to lay it out on the table and to say, this is what happened in its entirety. Where is the justice? Where is the truth? And what is it that we wish to learn from what has happened? And so that, for me, fiction is something that can achieve that very powerfully, because fiction moves you in a way that sometimes the news and human rights reports and academic articles and academic textbooks don't. And I love all of those sources of information, the news, documentaries, human rights reports. They are, I think, extremely important and serve a primary purpose. And at the same time, they are not for everybody, and they do not connect with everybody. They do not move or are read by or remembered by everybody. Whereas I think there is a way that fiction reaches us that other forms do not.
Absolutely, I can testify to that because, we all heard about civil war in Sri Lanka and here and there, sort of a familiar, but I actually do not know much until I read your book, and I started vigorously searching, researching, and enormous interest. Actually, I get to see a lot of nuances that you met through your book, and then I get to see in history. So it is very powerful and very interesting that. You write and then you articulate in this way. Let's go back to your first novel. Your first novel, Song of the Sun God, was first published in Sri Lanka in 2017 and was republished in Australia in 2022. The story begins in 1946 on the eve of Ceylon's independence from Britain, about a young Sri Lankan Tamil couple. The family's life is upended by the Sri Lankan civil war, leading to displacement and migration. The book examines the impact of war on individual lives, the challenges of assimilation in foreign lands, and the enduring quest for justice and identity. Was it the first novel you wrote? What inspired you to write that story?
It was definitely the first novel I wrote. That is my debut novel. And I was inspired. I started to write it in 2012, a few years after the war ended. And I was really, so the Sri Lanka Civil War ended in 2009. And I think that the inspiration for it was twofold. One was that I'd returned home to Australia from London. And when I moved back to Australia from London, bringing my family back home to my home, Australia, I realized that I did not feel at home in Australia, and that Australia, it was no longer the home that I thought it was, or perhaps had imagined it to be. And I struggled to understand the place of people of color um, in this place, and I struggled to understand, I could not see us being valued, our culture, our contributions. And we were certainly not in places of power, and we were not in places of art and storytelling and in the public. And that was really troubling to me, because I'd lived for 10 years by then in London, where cultural acceptance has evolved more dynamically and further along. And so I was struggling with this return home. And secondly, I was struggling with the aftermath of what had happened in Sri Lanka. And not personally, because I have lived a fortunate and privileged life in Australia, but what had happened to our people, and the failure for them to, for justice to be achieved for them. And I therefore turned my hand to fiction to try to tell an aspect of that story. I didn't imagine it would necessarily go on to be 4 generations, 4 continents, 3 or 4 continents, 70 years. It became a very large and sweeping novel. And I'm very proud of it, because it ended up being a very ambitious novel. But I don't think I knew what I was doing, or where I would land when I set off down that path, because it was my debut novel.
Why can you tell us why it was first published in Sri Lanka and was
Yes.
not published in Australia?
Look, I put it out for publication in 2014, and I simply couldn't find a publisher in Australia. I was rejected by Australian publishers and agents, although I was fortunate to then go on to get a really good Australian agent. But initially, the feedback, in particular from publishers, was that the novel was not Australian enough for the Australian market, that it wouldn't sell here, that Australians wouldn't be interested in it, and that it was essentially too much of a Sri Lankan novel. And yeah, this was very distressing for me, to be honest, because I am Australian. I've been raised here. I came here when I was 3. I think of myself as Australian Tamil, and it was a novel about colonization, about forced migration, about war, the impact of colonization, the creation of a new home. These are all the stories told by many, many Australians. And so it was a real repudiation for me to receive that feedback. And therefore, I went out further back to Sri Lanka, really, as it were. And there was a publisher there who was supportive and brave and wanted to take it on. And that then opened the door for further writing and further publications elsewhere, or rather back in Australia.
I'm sure this not Australian enough has blocked many writers.
I think so. I
So,
think so.
and you are the trailblazer. So
I
thankfully
thank you.
we have you, and then
Yeah.
starting with
That
opening
that's
door.
very kind.
Mm.
No, I'm sorry I keep cutting you off. It's very kind of you. I don't think I am the trailblazer. I think there's many excellent writers who've been writing and opening that door for us. So I feel fortunate to have had to be the beneficiary of the hard work that they've done.
Absolutely, collectively, yes. And your second book, The Barrier, is an action-packed, heavy, speculative thriller, which you're so good at. And then you went back again later on. And it's a dystopian novel and set in 2040. The novel, the story presents a world where a devastating Ebola pandemic and religious wars have led to a restructured global order. It sounds all familiar. In this
Mm,
new world, the Western alliances maintains control through enforced vaccinations that are not only protect against disease, but also suppresses the capacity for religious faith, effectively eliminating diverse belief systems. And then you wrote the story before this world was truly swept away by the COVID-19 pandemic.
mm,
Now, looking back, are you surprised and dismayed by some parallels between the
mm.
novels of dystopia elements and then this real world developments, in
Yeah.
the post-COVID world, which is so deeply divided?
I'm not surprised. I think the opening quote in that novel is by Albert Camus, and the quote is something like, "The history of mankind is the history of war and plague." And I think that was true when Camus wrote it, and will always be true of us, unfortunately. So I wasn't surprised, but I do continue to be dismayed by how easily we are divided. And pandemics will come and go. We've seen that throughout. If you just take just a snapshot of the last 200 years, there've been other pandemics. Last 500 years, there've been more pandemics. But the division that both came from that at that time, and then the divided world that we live in, then the world is always tribal, but it's become far more tribal, and far more harnessing of the politics of fear and division. I think that has been very disappointing. And I think I'm writing a piece, in fact, and I'm delivering a speech at the Sydney Writers' Festival on Friday, the 23rd of May, about this very topic and about the way in which fiction can be used and must be used to combat the divisions that are so easy to create now, and to fill that void of misinformation with the truth, and to utilize the long form of the novel, which is a place of quiet reflection. Even though The Barrier, for example, is quite a loud novel, there's action and there's fighting and there's so on, because it's a dystopic thriller. It is still a novel, and the novel always demands reflection, and it always demands a gradual unfolding of information, knowledge, one hopes also the truth and wisdom. And so I find myself increasingly reaching both to read novels in order to understand the world better and to write novels in order to try to help us understand ourselves.
Mm. Are you planning to write another dystopia novel?
I would love to.
Mm.
There's so much, this is going to sound awful. There's so much fun to write, Jing, that I would very much like to do another dystopic novel in the future. But my current novel is a contemporary political novel set in London, and partly in London, partly in India. And so I'll have to wait a little bit longer to give myself the treat of another dystopia.
So looking forward to it, to the new novel and to the next one. Your third novel, Chat Time at the Cinemas Gardens, love it to pieces. And I actually went with my daughter to Cinemas Gardens specifically because of the book. So we went to that
Yes.
area in Colombo. And the book was published in 2020 and it won the 2023 Miles Franklin Award. It is truly mind and eye-opening and a transformative book to me and to many people. But at first, I just want to ask how you were prompted to write the book. You
Mm.
actually wrote Unfinished Business at first, before you started a Chat Time at the Cinemas Gardens.
I did. I wrote Unfinished Business first, and then because the sales of The Barrier, my post apocalyptic Ebola and global religious war fiction, had not sold especially well, when we put Unfinished Business out into the market, and this is really only interesting, I think, to writers who are wondering how to get published, because the sales of The Barrier had been modest, the Unfinished Business was not interesting to publishers. They didn't want it. And therefore, I put it away. And I thought that my publishing career in Australia was over. And I had to come to terms, or tried to come to terms with that, because I wanted to be a published writer and to have a career writing novels and having them published. You're always a writer. If you write, you are a writer. But I had wanted to go further than that. And therefore I assumed that my publishing career was over, but that I would still continue to write. And I would write this novel set in a nursing home. And I would write honestly and freely because no one was going to read it. It would never be published, and it would only be read by my parents and my cousins. And so I could write freely and really explore the issues of race and racism, of the creation of the Australian national identity, the creation of any national identity, and the use of history and mythology in how we create identity to include some but to exclude others. And you'll see, as you've read it, you'll know it is a very candid exploration of that. And yes, and so the rest, I suppose, is history.
It is incredible, isn't it? If they, didn't push back on finish the business, you may not have written this Chat Time the way as it was written.
I think
Oh,
that's
what
right.
a triumphant. It's wonderful. By the way, I love the line in your book about the chat time. Chat time is a tea time, it's not a tea time. So chai, and I can relate to that because in Chinese, a chai is a tea. So we don't do
Mm,
chai,
yeah.
tea time. So it's really interesting. And about this book, because when I was doing my PhD 30 years ago in the early 1990s, and my PhD actually specifically in modern Australian fiction, and that I was really amazed. I mean, back then I wasn't so aware, but I knew that there were very few notable novels written by non-white Australians. So when I was reading Chat Time, in last year, and I was really blown my mind away, saying that the confidence and the conviction you have in defining, in pursuing Australian national identity. Because I was really struck by Ruben. Ruben said in the novel, I'm Sri Lankan Tamil and I'm Australian. I love that line. I want to say I'm Chinese and I'm Australian. Like many,
Mm,
I'm Vietnamese, I'm Australian. It's just a reading chat time. I had a strong interest in ever since, knowing anything about Sri Lanka. So when you wrote the book, especially after the blow about the first book, and they said wasn't Australian enough, and unfinished the business and may not be Australian enough. again. But when you wrote this book, were you confident that Australian readers would be able to resonate with and relate to the lived experiences of Sri Lankan Tamils in their home country and adopted Australia?
Mm. So
And also the historical trauma of Sri Lankan civil war, you know.
yeah, I think firstly, as I said, I didn't think anyone would read the book. Therefore, I didn't see the book as needing to connect with anyone. But I think I have always thought that there is so much about the lived experiences of so many Australians that resonate with each other. And you can replace the name of Sri Lanka and insert the name of another country and another culture, and you'll find not that the story by no means is identical, but that there is this commonality and ability to understand and ability to empathize and build a relationship with both the book, the reader, and the story and the writer. And I think that's one of maybe it's both a wonderful thing and in some ways a terrible thing that we all come from backgrounds where there is both not there's a shared trauma or a common trauma, but also shared resilience and shared love of family and shared love of culture and shared inspiration that we get from our elders and from our religion and our spirituality, and that is incredibly reassuring as we continue to take ourselves to the brink of an apocalypse. Yeah.
Yeah, it is remarkable and has worked out so well. It's incredible. And also the structure of the novel has worked out really remarkably as well. So, you know, there is a description. It's really about the current Australian nursing home and also, you know, racial and racism encountered and harrowing flashbacks of civil war in Sri Lanka. But these harrowing flashbacks or memories were often triggered by
Mm.
racial and race violence in present day Australia. And some of the violence description is so vivid, so hair-raising, as well as heartbreaking because they are all our Australian fellow Australians. How did it occur to you to link these two types of violence, you know, racial and
Yeah.
racism in Australia, as well as the you know, trauma in civil war in Sri Lanka, that they happened in different times in different countries, but you
Yeah.
linked them in this one book.
Yeah. I think perhaps the horrible thing about violence is that it is linked and it does come from a place of damage. It's usually damage to people who seek to damage others. And it comes from a place of more than anything, I think, the starting point is fear and ignorance and you know, an unhealthy dose of cruelty to boot. And so there is this commonality between all the kinds of violences that we see around the world, and it's almost just a matter of degree. You know, violence exists like many things on a spectrum. And so for me, there was a very natural, unfortunately, connection between what had happened in Sri Lanka and what happens in Australia, and also what had happened previously to our First Nations peoples and what continues to happen in many other parts of the world. And I wanted us to see both the commonality and the causation of it. There are things that happened in Sri Lanka that, you know, in 1948, for example, that led to what happened in 1983, that led to what happened in 2009 at the end of the war. And it's very hard to hold all of that in your mind at the same time, but it's very important at least to try to see it.
And people who read your books and would notice that you have this visceral, unflinching, graphic descriptions of those violence, and particularly in relation to Sri Lanka civil war. What made you not shy away from confronting readers with those very stark realities?
I think I feel a sense of responsibility and obligation, a sense of duty in a good way, I think in a good way, to people that have gone through that and have survived it, or the people that have gone through it and not survived it, to tell the truth, and to tell the truth in a way that the reader can receive the truth. And so I feel there is a real process when one is writing trauma to write it in a way that is not voyeuristic of somebody else's pain and is not exploitative of someone else's pain, that is very respectful and mindful of that pain, and an intentionality as to what you're saying and why you're saying it. And so the writer tries to balance all of those things, guided ultimately by the truth and a desire to honor both the suffering and the resilience of the people that have gone through those terrible things.
I truly admire your strengths and then the clarity of your writing and the bravery. It's really inspiring. And in this book, this Child Time ultimately is a very touching, heartwarming story and conveying the joy of human connections, resilience of individuals and community, and also a great sense of humor. And all these qualities, characterizations, or characteristics are very well represented by Maya, the central character. Where did you draw your inspiration for the character for Maya?
I think Maya is who I'd like to be when I grow up, Jing. I'd like to be confident and really, empowered by my storytelling and willing to just tell it as it is. So I think she's really come to me as what I hope to be the older version of myself. Not I'm not that confident now.
But where did you see Maya around you?
Yes, always.
Mm.
I've grown up raised by very strong and wonderful women, and in particular my grandmother. So,
Mm.
and she stayed at the nursing home, at a nursing home in Western Sydney. That was the inspiration for Cinnamon Gardens Nursing Home. And I used to visit her, and I would see her telling stories to us and to generations of my family. And I thought, what a wonderful place of community this is, and of intergenerational culture and memory sharing. And I would love to use that as a setting for a novel with someone as sparkling and as radiant as my grandmother, and then to give that character even something else, the added dimension of wanting to be a writer, and in fact, being a writer.
Mm. It is really surprising, a fascinating story coming out of a nursing home. Who would think? Oh, it is remarkable. You do have the magic in your creative writing to bring the story so interesting out of a nursing home. I also want to ask one more question before I bring out to students. Is unfinished business. Unfinished business I really enjoy because it's really mind-gripping and very fast-paced. And once you pick it up, you won't be able to stop, and tells a lot about the complexities of the war, as well as, spies, espionage, international espionage play out in Sri Lanka, involved all the great superpowers around the world. Absolutely compelling reading. My question is, when I was reading it, I couldn't stop thinking of this. How did you get yourself acquainted with the world of espionage and spies and intelligence agency? You never worked as one.
Well, Jing, I could tell you, but then I'd have to kill you. So I'm very fortunate. I have good friends who've got friends who've got friends, who are willing to share within the limits of all the non-disclosure and confidentiality agreements that they've signed, willing to assist me in the development of technology. I take a really good guess when I write. I research everything and find everything I can find, and then I imagine, because that's what creative writing is. So I give some of the tradecraft and the technology my own imagination to it, and then I go and check it with my friends of friends. And in some cases, I did go to Sri Lanka and interviewed many journalists and lawyers and activists about the kind of about the really the pressure and the security issues that they face on a day-to-day basis doing the work that they do. And that is, the making up technology and spy stuff is fun. The sitting with people who risk their lives to advocate for justice and to tell the truth is a real privilege, but also harrowing to listen to what they do. And all of that, I try to bring all of that together in a thriller, in a political thriller.
Mm. I so enjoy your thriller. I'm sure you're going to write another thriller,
I
down the
hope so.
track.
Yes,
Mm.
I will. Ellie is a returning character,
Yeah,
so I'd like to write
exactly.
her a novel two,
Yeah.
number two.
Mm. Now I'll bring out our creative writing student, Jodie Lee. So, Judy, welcome to the conversation.
Thank you for your generosity and your time. I want to ask, because you write these huge, complex, traumatic themes and in all of your books, how do you kind of work with that and hold that without sort of, I guess, despairing is probably not the, but yeah, just holding all of that and writing it down and being with it. How do you sort of like, I guess, have downtime, or how do you write that kind of trauma for such like extended periods of time and creating these
Yeah.
works? Yeah.
Thank you, Jodie. That's a beautiful question. So I have had trauma-informed care training, and I would really recommend that, particularly if you're going to work with real people who've been in these places and experienced these things, to undertake that training, regardless of whatever your career is. So I've had that training as a lawyer, and you can do it through Blue Knot, for example. I've done it through many legal organizations. And so there is not just the, and that's, I know that you're asking me about myself, and it's important to look after oneself.
Mm.
And so I am careful about when I write these things, what I do afterwards, for example. So self care afterwards, even something simple like lying on the sofa in my pajamas watching back to back episodes of Parks and Rec is a really important part of my self therapy, preferably with a child, wrapped. And I find myself doing things like just head counting my children at the end of a day after I've written something terrible, because I write about people who have lost the most important things in their life. And I need to know that my most important things, at least for this time period, God willing, for as long as possible, are there. And so there is that. There's also, though, for me, and I really appreciate the question, and I always give this answer because I really want people to understand that what I write about is something that I write about. And I do it through in-depth research, and I do it through communication with people. And when I communicate with them, I'm extremely mindful of what they have been through. And so I will always do it in a certain way. I will never go to someone and ask them questions. I will wait for people to come to me and say to me, I understand you're writing a novel. I'd like to tell you the story.
Mm-hmm.
But then the really important part of this answer to your very important question is that I am only a writer. And I don't say this with false modesty or false self effacement. I am only a writer. I am writing the experiences of incredible people who have suffered and survived terrible things. And my job is to try to honor that as truthfully as possible in a way that will be read and heard and connected with by other people. That's my job. And so I try very hard to do that properly for them.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you. Are you writing something, Jodie?
Oh, look, I'm a book editor, and I've started doing my Masters of Research at
Okay.
US. So it's interesting to see the processes, and I guess also your story of publishing and that notion of, are you Australian enough to publish? I know working in publishing, I used to be, because I was the only, I guess, Chinese Australian editor in some of these publishing houses that I worked. So it was really interesting to see books come in where I'd go, I think they've out, but yeah, there was that period where it was difficult. Publishers would go, no, no one's going to read it. So it's really quite heartening to see that there is more and more coming out and being published, which is great. And so yeah,
Yes.
so it's fabulous that your story came through.
Thank you very much. You'll check out today's announcement of the Miles Franklin Literary Award long
I
list.
know, I
Some
saw it.
superb writers, including a dear friend, Yumna Kassab,
Yep.
and Melanie Cheng,
Yep.
Xiang Liu.
Yes. It's very exciting, and it's
It's a
sort of like
really
you
exciting
see that
list.
and you go, it's finally like the dam's broken in a
That's right.
way.
That's right.
So I have a question from a student, and he sent this questions through. He said, firstly, I want to say, Shankari, how much I enjoyed child time at the Cinemas Gardens. Your technique and craft are incredibly evocative, cohesive, and compelling. I couldn't put the book down. A question I have about your treatment of the white characters in the book. Some of them, despite being key characters, seemed to lack depth and intellect. For example, Gary's is a character. While it is very well written, it felt somewhat one-dimensional to me. And similarly, Nikki's honesty and simplicity sometimes made her appear quite naive. Was this a deliberate choice on your part? And thank you for creating such a captivating story.
Oh, beautiful. Great question. I had to go back and back and back to try to give the right amount, what I considered to be the right amount of complexity and depth to Nikki and to Gareth. And Gareth in particular, he is the villain of the story, and he should be the villain of the story. At the same time, I wanted him to be the kind of villain or the kind of character where you know a Gareth, and Gareth is the father of your kids' friends, and in fact, you have displayed and behaved as a Gareth yourself at some point in your life, perhaps yesterday. And so I wanted him to be more complex than a typical villain. At the same time, he still had to do the job of the villain. He had to do the bad things. And Nikki is, when you study what role characters play in any work of art, Nikki is in many ways the foil to both Ruben and Gareth, and indeed to some degree to Anjali, even though I think Nikki perhaps gets more real estate in the novel than Anjali. But Nikki's role is to support the action of the protagonists rather than to be the protagonist herself. And I remember talking to my children about this, about the novel, and deconstructing, because I did an exercise where I actually split all of the characters up and I wrote down how many pages each character had been given for their point of view, to really challenge myself and ask myself, have I given each character, or at least the right characters, the right amount of real estate or pages? And it's not just obviously about the pages, but the pages is a good metric to give you an indication of how deep your characters are. And so, and I remember saying to my children, look, I don't know if I got it right. Are they balanced? Is it balanced? Is it equal? And my children, my two younger boys, were quite young at that age, and one of them turned to me and he said, does it have to be balanced, or does it just have to be right? Does it just have to be truthful? And I thought, well, that's a very interesting question, because the story that I want to tell and the world that I live in and the world that these characters live in is a world where white people, through their naivety, ignorance, and malice, do certain things. And brown people have to respond, react, and rise above it. That's the story I want to tell. And in fact, that's the world that I live in. And just because my white neighbor, Jane Butler, who I love and who is in the novel as the great neighbor to Anjali, lives a very different experience because she's white, doesn't mean that my experience is less valid. So I will tell the story that I live.
Oh, I can so relate to that, and I perfectly understand where you're from, about the world we live in, and then people that we reacted to or responded to. I remember when I first came over 30 years ago, I was studying at Sydney University for my PhD, but I was doing a living and to make a living. And the person that the house that I lived in, and I was telling them my family story and telling them my dad was a historian, and a very great historian, as well as very good at cooking. And his response ignored the historian part and said, oh, would he come to cook for me?
Damn.
Yeah, so I sort of can, yeah, I can relate to the world that we lived in, the way that we were seen, you know, by white people who do not necessarily appreciate it. But that was many years ago. Things have changed a lot, and I have to. And also, it's interesting. Another experience I always remember that one is my son was in high school, and he was telling his friends that asked, oh, you know, where your mum worked. And I have worked at SBS for 23 years proudly. And he said, oh, mum worked at SBS. And then the boy said, oh, Li Lingqing is your mum. So
Gosh.
it's really interesting the way that people respond, you know. So yeah. So it's really now I must ask the question, one more question about your book Safe Haven, and it's also a very interesting. Each book tells a different story, but in such a different way and a different aspect of human life. And Safe Haven returns to the theme of institutional injustice and human rights violations, telling a story about refugee and asylum seekers, in particular the tragic suicide of a 14-year-old Sri Lankan refugee. Was your story inspired by the real event? That what we call Bilarila family.
Yeah, absolutely. In part inspired by the Biloela family, and their, you know, the dangers of imminent deportation that they faced, and the way that their community in Biloela rose up to try to support them. And also there was a family in Victoria where in Apollo Bay, and there was an elderly Australian lady who helped a Sri Lankan refugee who'd landed on Christmas Island, and created a family around him, and then helped him to navigate the immigration system and to create a life in Apollo Bay after he was released from Christmas Island. And that community of Apollo Bay was also a real inspiration for me, because they loved him and they wanted to embrace him as one of their own, as family, as Australian. And I found the strength of those two communities so inspiring, and really wanted to elevate that.
I have to ask this last question from our audience. So Kate Fagan, Associate Professor, she's the Director of the Writing and Research and Society Research Centre. So she's asking the question on behalf of the students about cultural safety. You know, social media these days can generate division very quickly or dismiss the cultural complexities. How do you recommend young writers deal safely with the world of social media, self-promotion, and cultural storytelling, telling you. Oh, thank you for your beautiful books.
I would be my advice is perhaps advice that I give to myself, which is to be very clear about who I am as a writer and what it is that I want to write about. I will try to keep my communications on social media honest but simple and short. And then I try to spend as little time on social media as possible. So I tend to not read comments, and I bill my time mentally as a lawyer. I bill my time. So I say to myself, do I either want to be doing something on social media, or do I want to be writing a book? And I always want to be writing a book. So I will step away.
Great advice. Shankari, we can't thank you enough. Such an interesting talk. I enjoyed it so much, and I love all your answers. They're great, you know, so thank you so much.
Thank you, and thank you for your time today, and thank you for really appreciating my work. I'm feel so rewarded by it.